Hi everybody, this video is going to introduce CSS and show you a few different ways to use CSS to add style to your pages, your web pages. So first of all, what CSS is another language that's layered with HTML to create the appearance of a web page. So the HTML, as you've seen, gives the page content and structure. You actually type your actual text and then put that inside HTML tags, and you also you use HTML tags to mark up other types of content like images and structural components like the body or the head or the title of a page or things like images and videos. So it wasn't necessarily clear at first, but one of the reasons you want to do all of that marking up is actually so that you can have access to those those selectors, those things that you used to mark up the page, like the heading tags and the paragraph tags, the image tags. Not only do they tell the browser something about how to display that item, but they actually also allow you to select and style the item with CSS, and so that's what we'll be doing now. So first of all, I'm just going to show you a few excerpts from a really good textbook that's really well laid out and kind of does a good job of explaining how CSS works. So you'll notice this example explains CSS as kind of drawing an invisible box around every HTML element. So imagine that you have this web page here. It's a basic HTML web page. Imagine that there's a big box around the whole thing. That's the body. And then imagine another smaller box for the H1, another smaller box for the paragraph, and then another small box inside that box for what looks like it's italic, so it would either be an I tag or an emphasis tag. And you can see there's another paragraph here that's got its own box, and this paragraph has got its own box, and other smaller components are inside their own little boxes. So these boxes don't show up on the screen, but it's a useful visualization because, as you'll see, I mean, literally these wireframed boxes don't show up on the screen, but these components in the web page do have boundaries. And so actually when you start styling things, things like the margins are on the outside, and literally just the shape of the box that something is in can actually be visible if you style it to be visible. So being able to imagine it as each component being surrounded by boxes is pretty helpful. One thing that I should also point out is the difference between block elements and inline elements. So block elements are ones that look like they start on a new line. So things like the H1, if you put another H in general, if you put another any H tag really, an H tag is going to create its own line. A P tag will start on its own line, and sort of fill up the width of the page if you don't tell it to do otherwise. Inline elements are things like image tags, bold, emphasis, strong, things like that. Those things will go in line with text. So things like this italicized cottage garden, it doesn't create its own line. Just wanted to point that out. So how do you use CSS? Well, all those things that you have been, all those things that you've been using to mark up your pages with HTML, those are actually going to be used as selectors for CSS. So it associates rules with HTML elements. The rules govern how the content of a specified element should be displayed. So you'll see that there's two parts, a selector and a declaration. In other words, there's there's this section where you select what you are going to make a rule for, and then what the rule is. So for example, this is a paragraph tag. You would say P, curly brace, and then inside the curly braces, because you have a closing curly brace as well, all of the rules for what you want to do with paragraph tags would go inside those curly braces. So you could specify what type of font. In this case, font-family is a certain kind of rule that says use this group of fonts, and Arial is a certain kind of font. So this specifies what kind of font to use. Here's another example of the CSS declarations, how they're structured. Again, they're inside curly braces. They have a property and a value. In other words, what property of that HTML element are you setting a rule for? And then what is the actual setting? So what font family do you want? Arial. What color do you want? Yellow. And again, like, let's say, for example, here's this example. You have all of H1, H2, and H3. You can do that. You can actually, instead of just saying one, for example, just paragraph tags, you could specify a whole bunch of different tags. You could say, you could have any number of different types of tags separated by commas, and if you want them all to have the same rule, and you could say inside curly braces what the rules are for styling those elements. So things like this will set the font, this will set the color, and that will be applied to all of these tags, H1, H2, and H3. So anything that's an H1 or an H2 or an H3 will be Arial font and will be yellow. Notice these things are inside curly braces. The property is followed by a colon, and then the value is followed by a semicolon. This syntax matters. You have to type it this way. If you don't type it this way, it will cause errors. It won't work. So make sure that you are saying, when you're typing out your CSS code, what you're selecting, what type of element you're selecting, curly brace and a closing curly brace. And then inside those two curly braces, you say, what property do you want to set? A colon, then the value for that property, and a semicolon. So I think what I'll do is I'm just going to go ahead and show you a live example, and you can follow along, create your own example in REPL. So just create a new REPL, call it something like CSS intro. That's what I called mine. And you'll notice in REPL, remember we talked about this at the beginning, besides an HTML file that it creates by default for you, and it also creates a JavaScript file, which we're not really working with yet, but it also creates a CSS file. So you don't actually have to create one. You could if you wanted to, but you don't really have to create your own. It's already here. So let's just work with the default file style.css that was created here. But first we're going to need some content. I think I'm just going to go grab a little bit of content from a random Wikipedia page. I see Tom Brady's actually right on the home page. That I could just use Tom Brady. Let's just see what randomness gives me, though. Random article. That's short. Dawes Castle. Interesting. That's a flower. Let's just go with Tom Brady. I tried. Where's the actual link? There we go. Thomas Edward Patrick Brady. I'm just going to copy a little bit of text from Wikipedia, and I'm going to use that as my content. Don't really need JavaScript. I'm actually just going to overwrite the JavaScript for this. All right, so we've got, I'm just going to, we know we're going to need a paragraph tag. And a closing paragraph tag. I'll do the same thing. I'm going to have two different paragraphs, and you'll see why in a minute. I want to separate them out and have some stylistic differences. I'll add a paragraph tag and a closing paragraph tag. And then I'll add an H1, Tom Brady. So here you see it's just displaying the plain text. So let's add some style to this. So it's no longer just plain black and white text with nothing added to it. So what I'm going to do, I think the first thing that I'll add is I'm just going to add specific background colors for different types of elements. You'll see what the impact of that is. So I'm going to go over to my style.css. I'll say body. Background, and REPL should start recommending stuff, so you don't usually have to type out everything completely. Like it says, I want background color. If you really don't feel like typing everything out completely, it starts suggesting options. I'm going to choose background color. I'm going to say light gray, I think I want. Let's see if light gray is even a, yeah, it is. This is nice that we'll get into more of the details of working with color in CSS later, but it's nice that REPL recommends CSS capable colors because and not that it's difficult, but you do have to there is sort of an extra step to sort of choosing your own color otherwise. There's not, not every single color can be spelled out. There are a number of different ways to specify color, which we'll get into. But in the meantime, just typing out the color is fine for now. So I'm going to say background color light gray for the body, and then I'll specify for a paragraph tag background color white. When I run this, you'll see I now have a frame around my paragraphs. So the reason for this is that I specified for the entire body of the page, everything that, just sort of the basic starting point background color is light gray. However, the way CSS works, CSS is called CSS because it's named cascading style sheets. It's a style sheet, and it cascades, which is a weird way of describing its behavior. But what it does is it kind of goes, it cascades. I mean, it kind of, imagine like a waterfall that maybe drops a little bit, and then it continues, and it drops a little bit, and then it goes a little bit more, it drops it a little bit more. It's cascading from one level to another. That's kind of what CSS does. It goes from one level to another, and the rules go from one level to another. So as you go from a more general level to a more specific level, the more specific level is the one that displays. So paragraph is more specific than body. So in cases where there's nothing else, it is going to display the body style. However, the paragraph style is going to display for a paragraph because paragraph is more specific. Similarly, it also cascades just from, not only does it go from general to specific, but it also goes from top to bottom, just of the page, like sort of the last thing you do is the thing that will display. So if I just for some reason have two conflicting paragraph tags, this isn't really a good idea, but I just wanted to show you for the sake of demonstration. If I have two conflicting paragraph tags, notice blue overwrote white. The last thing is the thing that displays. I'm going to get rid of that because I don't even want it there. But I just kind of wanted to show you that it also goes from top to bottom, and the last thing that it reads is the thing that sort of wins. It overwrites the previous thing. So specific overrules general, and lower in the order, like later in the list, overrules higher up in the list. You could think of it as, literally just what did it read last. Like if imagine the computer is reading the code from top to bottom, it's just doing these things as it reaches them. Well, whatever it reached last is the thing you're going to see because it just did it. And then in general, specific tends to override in general. So anyway, let's add a few more styles. So I have the body of this is white. How about my H1? So my H1 tag, let's also set a background color for that. That's different from the default background color. I don't know. Well, the problem with maroon is it'll probably be too dark. Well, let's try it anyway, just for the banner. Medium aquamarine. Well, I meant to hit maroon, but whatever. Let's go with medium aquamarine. And you'll see that there's a different setting now. There's a different style for the H1 as well. So besides background color, you can set text color. So maybe I want my H1 and I am actually going to skip a line here. So CSS does not require this. This isn't part of the language, but this is just sort of common programming practice. When you have curly braces marking the beginning and end of something, it's often just sort of a stylistic choice people make. It's to have the beginning curly brace be the end of that line and the closing curly brace be on its own separate line. It creates a little bit of white space here, and it helps separate things apart from each other. I highly recommend you do it. I find the code is way easier to read that way, and it's also easier to find your missing curly braces if you mess up and you leave a curly brace out, because it's much clearer where it should be. So I highly recommend you use this this convention of opening a curly brace and skipping a line, and then having the closing curly brace on the next line. Your code on its own line at the end. The code will run if you don't do that. CSS doesn't care about white space on the page. It doesn't care about empty space, but I highly recommend it just as a organizational tool. So for my H1, I meant to do something maroon. How about I go back to maroon? Let's go with my actual font color. So in the case of text elements, color refers to the text itself, and then background color refers to the background. So I'm going to say color. I was trying to use maroon before. Let me use maroon now. There we go. And another thing you can set is the font. So for the whole page, for example, I could say font family. Usually you specify a group of fonts. You can say specify a very specific font. And if somebody's browser runs that, that's great, but then you should also probably specify something more generic. So let me just web safe fonts. Let me just show you what I mean by that. So this is a list of like the most common fonts that are in that like pretty much every browser is going to support. These are just like the most basic fonts that you've seen. Arial is just is a sans serif font, which means those little sort of tails and notches that are on things like Times New Roman, like this text, for example. How the letters have little lines at the bottom, and sometimes little tails on the ends and things like that. Those are called serifs. So a sans serif font means it is without serif. It doesn't have a serif. So just a plain text that kind of looks like handwritten print, that would be something like Arial, Verdana, Helvetica. What you just saw on the other page, like Times New Roman or Georgia, are really common serif fonts. And so what you can do is you can specify something. Let's find like a weird one that's not web safe. Trying to find one serifed. Here we go. Playfair. It's a serifed font. Not sure it'll actually display. I don't think it really did, but what you can do is you can actually separate. So let's say you try Playfair, then maybe you could say Georgia, which is a far more common font. And you notice that actually REPL is specifying an entire family of fonts. It's saying Georgia, how about Times New Roman, Times, and any serifed font, right? So this is like this is sort of the most this is the way fonts are commonly listed in CSS, is kind of a preferred font, another preferred font, and then defaults that that the browser can default to if none of those other fonts are available on that browser. Let's see what I get with it. It ends up it does end up giving me a serif font, probably Georgia. I don't think Playfair is actually available. I bet nothing will happen if I erase that. See, nothing happened. I'm pretty sure it's just displaying Georgia. That's a fairly common font. So you could see, you could specify font. And if you wanted to, you could specify a different font, for example, for H1s or for paragraphs. So maybe you want a serifed font for readability in your paragraph, but you want something else in your H1. You could say font family go with like Arial, Helvetica, sans serif. Right, so now you see this font is clearly different from these. These look more like Times New Roman. This doesn't have those little lines on it. It doesn't have those serifs. So you can specify different fonts for different for different situations, and you can use You use the selectors to select what you want the font to apply to, or what you want any style to apply to. So I think that is all for now, and we will get more into the details of how CSS works in a future video.